He blasted rocks to make money. He collected cars like they were prizes. And he turned a junkyard in the Canadian countryside into one of Netflix's most loved car-fixing shows. Mike Hall, known as Rasta Blasta from Rust Valley, won over fans because he chased his dream with everything he had, even when the numbers didn't add up. But while we watched him bring old cars back to life, Mike was quietly dealing with stress, growing bills, and the hard reality of running a dream like a business. So when he suddenly held a huge auction and got rid of hundreds of cars, fans everywhere were left asking the same thing. What happened to Mike Hall? Why give up the very thing that made him who he is? Stay tuned to find out. Mike Hall, known as the Rasta Blaster, was the kind of guy who lived life at full speed both at work and off it. Born in 1956 in St. Boniface, Manitoba, Canada, Mike's early years were pretty normal until his dad got a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway. That move took the family west to Kamloops, British Columbia, where Mike's lifelong love for cars started to grow. From a young age, he was hooked. By the time he turned 20, he was already collecting cars, especially muscle cars, the kind that roared and rumbled like nothing else. He often said his love for them was in his blood. Growing up in the 1960s, surrounded by that raw power and style, he became addicted to the thrill of fast cars, a passion that would stick with him for life. When Mike went out on his own, he didn't jump straight into the car world. Instead, he started a company called Chimera Springs Rockworks Limited, where he became known as a rock blaster. It was dangerous, high-excitement work, exactly the kind of challenge Mike loved. His job was all about drilling, scaling, and blasting rocks to make steep slopes safe, especially along tricky parts of the road where landslides could mean trouble. As Mike liked to say, he spent years hanging from cliffs and blowing things up. The company did well, and Mike made a good amount of money in the construction business. But anyone who knew him also knew exactly where a lot of that money went. Straight into his growing collection of vintage and muscle cars. While he was out on the road blasting rocks for Chimera Springs Rockworks, his jobs took him all over British Columbia. And in every small town or hidden back road he visited, he'd spot some old forgotten car that most people would drive past without even noticing. But not Mike. To him, every rusted shell was a sleeping beauty, just waiting for its second chance. He was away from home about 10 months a year. And with the kind of money he was making, he didn't think twice about buying cars wherever he found them. Getting them home was another story. Sometimes he'd haul them back on trailers. Other times he'd squeeze them into dump trucks or use whatever vehicle could get the job done. That spark for collecting actually started long before his blasting career back, when he was just a kid in Kamloops. As the years rolled on, that hobby turned into something much bigger. Mike's collection grew so fast he eventually bought a 26-acre farm just to store his growing fleet. Before long, hundreds of old cars and trucks filled the land like a graveyard of Canadian car history. But even the most patient wife has limits. His wife finally told him the farm couldn't work as a car lot anymore. So Mike came up with a plan. He bought a 5-acre property in Tappan, perfectly zoned for auto wrecking, and set up shop right next to the White Post Auto Museum. He even made a deal to store some of his vehicles on the museum grounds. Over the decades, his collection grew to nearly 400 cars. What started with a handful in his 20s turned into hundreds by his 60s. He joked that it was an addiction, one that kept getting harder to manage. At some point, Mike started wondering what would happen to it all when he was gone. With his father having died at 60 and many of his friends facing health issues, he realized his own time might be limited. The question hit hard. What would his wife and kids do with 400 cars sitting in a field? The thought pushed him to act. In 2016, he listed the entire property, cars included, for $1.19 million. But surprisingly, no one bought it. A year later, frustrated but not giving up, he raised the price to $1.45 million. And honestly, the offer was more than fair. The deal included the 5-acre property already zoned for auto salvage, plus a fixed-up home, a 900-square-foot restoration shop, and a larger 1,200-square-foot steel building. He even threw in enough steel beams and rafters to build another 8,000 square feet of coverwork space. And of course, there were the cars, more than 340 classic vehicles, each worth anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands. When asked why he was letting it all go, Mike gave a simple reason. He had planned to restore them all in retirement, but life had other ideas. A massive 5-year rock-scaling contract landed in his lap, pushing retirement even further down the road. And at 60 years old, he knew the clock wasn't exactly on his side. Selling the property, though, turned out to be its own challenge. Winter buried the yard under 6 feet of snow, and buyers weren't exactly lining up to dig through a frozen sea of old metal. But his real estate agent, Hudson Purba from Century 21 Desert Hills Realty, never lost hope. Eventually, the story started spreading like wildfire. Headlines popped up about an older Canadian man selling hundreds of classic cars along with his land. Collectors from around the world took notice. Individual car orders started rolling in, and soon television producers caught wind of the story. You see, Mike had already appeared on the hit Canadian series Highway Through Hell, where he'd shown off his blasting skills by clearing dangerous boulders off the roads. The director of that show, Matt Shuchik, remembered him well. So when news started spreading about a wild car collector in British Columbia trying to sell a property filled with hundreds of vintage vehicles, Matt immediately thought of Mike. He, along with fellow producer Tyson Hepburn, both from Mayhem Entertainment, saw a golden opportunity. Matt reached out and pitched the idea straight. They wanted to build a show entirely around Mike, his cars, and his world in Tappan. At that point, Mike had been struggling to sell his property. The deal offered him a chance to do what he loved, restore cars, and get paid for it. They filmed a pilot episode, and it didn't take long to impress the big players. Chorus Entertainment jumped on board almost immediately, ordering a full 8-part series. The result was Rust Valley Restorers, a joint production between Mayhem Entertainment and Big Time Decent Productions Incorporated. It premiered on December 6, 2018, and right from the start, it struck a chord with audiences. Viewers couldn't get enough of Mike's energy. With his wild dreadlocks, larger-than-life personality, and unshakable passion for cars, he stood out from the usual reality TV crowd. He wasn't just another mechanic. He was a character, someone who loved every beat-up old car like it was family. By the time Mike Hall started filming the very first season of Rust Valley Restorers, he was already in his 60s. He knew the clock was ticking, and those hundreds of classic cars scattered across his property weren't getting any younger. So instead of watching them slowly decay, Mike made a bold move. He turned his lifelong passion into a real business. That's how Rust Brothers was born. Mike and his crew had a different vision. They weren't chasing high-end showpieces or million-dollar collector cars. Their goal was to bring back vehicles that regular folks could afford, cars that people could actually drive and enjoy. The shop itself sat in a place Mike nicknamed his Field of Dreams, tucked between the Rocky Mountains and the desert, a spot known to locals as Rust Valley. Each episode followed Mike, his best friend Avery Schoaf, and his son Connor Hall as they hunted through the yard for their next project. But here's where things got tricky. Mike was used to doing big restorations with no budget limits. Running a tight, cost-conscious shop was new territory. As a result, he quickly found himself overspending on almost every project. Despite the show's growing popularity, the business side of things wasn't going so smoothly. He admitted that he was losing money on most of his builds, saying he'd only ever broken even on 2 cars. Take the 1966 Lincoln Continental, for example. The plan was to keep the restoration under $15,000 and flip it for a profit. But costs spiraled way beyond that. The same story repeated itself with his beloved Chevelle SS 396. Mike had hoped for $25,000, but had to settle for just $10,000, barely enough to keep the lights on. And while Mike was driven by passion, his son Connor was all about practicality. Connor constantly reminded his dad that every dollar spent had to make sense. Then came one of their toughest builds yet, a 1963 Continental convertible. What was supposed to be a $17,000 restoration ended up costing a staggering $50,000. Mike explained it best. Filming a reality show slows everything down. With cameras around, production takes longer, mistakes cost more, and efficiency goes out the window. He estimated that the extra time and effort added about 30% more to every project, a loss he personally absorbed. For Mike, One of the biggest challenges in running the business was the constant tension between estimates and quotes. An estimate was a rough guess, but a quote was a promise. And when costs shot past those promised numbers, things got heated. That financial strain and the stress it caused between Mike, Avery, and Connor became one of the most authentic parts of the show. But the toughest part for him wasn't the long hours or the costs. It was saying goodbye to the cars. After pouring so much heart into bringing them back to life, selling them off always hit him the hardest. Yet somehow, Mike's already massive collection of rusted classics just kept on growing. What started as roughly 400 vehicles eventually ballooned to around 550 by 2021. That's when Mike finally made one of the toughest decisions of his life. He chose to auction off his entire collection. It wasn't because he wanted to, but because he had run out of time, space, and energy to keep them all. He had already sold the land where the cars were stored. And if it didn't act fast, many of them would have ended up crushed for scrap. For car lovers everywhere, this was incredible news. Fans who've been following Mike's journey since the show's debut in 2018 finally had a chance to own a piece of his legendary field of dreams. The auction was organized by Alberta-based EG Auctions, also known as the Electric Garage, and it was shaping up to be huge. They planned to live stream the entire event, attracting bidders not only from Canada, but from around the world. By the eve of the auction, more than 7,000 online bidders had already registered. Every single one of the 500 vehicles was listed with no reserve, meaning whoever made the highest bid, no matter the amount, would take it home. Among the sea of project cars were 3 special rides fully restored by Mike and his Rust Valley team. A 1970 Chevrolet Camaro, a 1955 Chevy two-door station wagon, and a 1970 Chevy K5 Blazer. As the countdown to auction day began, Mike kept himself busy with one final project. But as the night before the auction rolled in, the weight of it all hit him. At 8 p.m., Todd called to share some exciting news. They had already broken their record for registered bidders. Still, Mike couldn't relax. He lay awake that night, his mind racing, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. He was gambling his entire legacy on this one event, and he knew it. When the big day finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric but heavy. Mike struggled deeply with the idea of saying goodbye to his field of dreams. Todd and the EG Auctions crew did everything they could to keep things organized. But when it came time to face the moment, Mike froze. Connor and Avery had to practically drag him to the auction site. Walking through the rows of cars he'd spent decades collecting, Mike felt overwhelmed, his heart pounding, his stomach in knots. When the auction finally went live, the excitement was off the charts. Around 700 online buyers were tuned in, watching every moment as the event streamed across the world. As the last car crossed the auction block, Todd Schwint from EG Auctions shared the results with Mike. It was a runaway success. The final total came in at a staggering $750,000. That was an incredible outcome for a single-day event held in such a remote corner of British Columbia. For Mike, though, it was a bittersweet day. He stood there watching fellow car lovers snapping up vehicles he'd owned for decades. Deep down, he knew it was time to let them go. Originally, Mike had planned to keep just 10 cars for himself, but by the time everything was said and done, that number had jumped to 52. For a man like Mike, that still counted as progress. Yet, if you know Mike Hall, you know that old habits die hard. Before the 4th season of Rust Valley Restores wrapped up, there he was welcoming a new delivery to his shop. Another rusty classic car. Avery wasn't the least bit surprised. He's seen it all before and knows that Mike's love for cars is something that'll never fade.